Hello and welcome, I'm Oles Gerjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. EU ambassadors have agreed to impose additional sanctions against 8 Russian citizens. The subjects of the sanctions are considered to have been involved in the seizure of Ukrainian naval ships and sailors near the Kerch Strait in November 2018. The Russians' bank accounts in the EU will be frozen and they will be banned from entering the European Union. Meanwhile, a bipartisan group of American senators introduced a bill containing new sanctions on Russia over its meddling in the US elections and aggression against Ukraine. To talk more about the Western sanctions policy towards Russia, we are joined in the studio today by Ilya Ponomarev, former Russian MP who had to flee the country because of politically motivated persecution. Hello and thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Let's just remind the audience that you were one and only MP who voted against of the annexation of Crimea when you still
That's right.
Yes, when you still were MP until 2016, right? So we're talking about Russian sanctions, or sanctions imposed on Russia, and EU diplomats agreed to freeze assets and to impose visa bans on 8 individuals, right? Because of this capture of 24 Ukrainian sailors. So it is still unknown who is on the list, right?
Yes, nobody knows.
No details. But these sanctions are individual. How would you assess the volume of them?
I think it's more symbolic thing rather than a real thing. And most likely those 8 guys, they should be members of Russian border service. Which are not traveling anyway because Russia has imposed ban on its servicemen to travel abroad for quite a while ago. So I think it's more a symbolic thing. The thing that has been discussed in the US, in Congress, those sanctions from hell, this is more real than what the European Union did.
Do we have any details about these American sanctions?
Oh, yes, because we know the actual piece of legislation that was introduced in the Senate. And we know the evolution of that piece of legislation, that there is some, because in the original version that was discussed, I believe, last fall, several of Russian state banks, they were enumerated. And named, in particular, like Sberbank and VTB and others. And in the current version, it's to be decided by US President.
This is interesting. Well, also the European Union is going to extend the existing sanctions list against 163 individuals and 44 legal entities for undermining the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So, speaking of this, the US is about to impose a new sanctions package. The European Union is extending the existing sanctions. How do Russian citizens treat and react to such a position of world community?
Well, as you know, there are 2 different types of sanctions. One type of sanctions is broad economic sanctions. And
Crimea sanctions, so to say.
No, actually, when it started with Crimea, it was about certain individuals who were particularly in charge of the annexation of Crimea. Actually, the first set of economic sanctions was introduced after Donbass. And they were also called sectoral sanctions. So sanctions about certain sectors of Russian economy, like the ban of investing into oil and gas industry and being engaged in large projects with Russian state corporations, these type of things. So about them, Russians are generally skeptical. I mean, skeptical in the bad sense of this meaning of this word, because what Russian media says, and I think they're actually quite accurate on this, is that, you see, by doing this, foreign nations, they show that they're enemy of yours, and you all are living bad, not because our government has done something wrong, but because of West is doing something wrong. And actually that allows Mr. Putin to write off a lot of his own mistakes and a lot of his own wrongdoings at the expense of the relations between Russian common people, ordinary people, and the West. So I don't think that they are very productive. The personal sanctions which are in this package and that were in the previous packages, vice versa. They are taken positive and they are efficient, because when, for example, Mr. Deripaska or Mr. Vekselberg, the ill-known, badly known Russian oligarchs, are being particularly punished for, in particular, stealing money from Russian people, this is what Russians like. And this is what shows that West can be a friend rather than an enemy.
By saying that Russian media is accurate about this position, do you mean that they are right, or they are just determined to this position?
No, I mean that they agree with this position, because it's so easy to portray, because they don't see how they themselves could have been influential in terms of making the decisions on the war. They have no power of vote. You know, it's been decided in the Kremlin, and that's why they say, okay, so we have been punished for something which we don't know whether we have done or not.
Yes, but on the other hand, only people can overthrow their regime. And
I totally agree with you, but at the end of the day, we need to think about the political consequences. We need these sanctions to be efficient. I'm right now, for example, trying to prove to my own constituents in Novosibirsk, we were planning to build a bridge across Ob River, and that was supposed to be a major Siberian project, and the funds from that bridge were diverted to build the bridge across Kerch Strait. So there is right now no bridge over Ob River, but there is a bridge over the Kerch Strait. And I'm telling people, okay, so if there was no annexation of Crimea, we could have had the bridge. But they say, no, these matters are totally different. They don't understand the link between one and another.
Or they do not want to understand.
And they do not want to understand this. But anyway, they don't understand. This is a fact at the end of the day. And that's why we need to do those sanctions which are productive in terms of one objective, to stop the war and to get rid of Mr. Putin.
Well, so what are your ideas? What could be the sanctions targeting not the population, but the Kremlin? So you think that individual sanctions are more effective?
Yes, individual sanctions are definitely effective. They disrupt the unity in the Russian elites. They force Putin's own cronies to start telling their boss, look, we need to do something about it. We maybe need to change the course at least a little bit, but to stop it.
Well, maybe these sanctions, they also are meant to pressure the economy so Russia cannot invest so much in their military-industrial complex, so then they cannot have so much power and pose so much threat worldwide, because it's recognized that Russia is the main threat.
This is a right consideration, but in practice it's not working, because Europeans are not playing well enough, you know, in terms of those sanctions. Individual corporations, even US corporations, are not comply fully with the spirit of those sanctions. They try to bypass them by different means, because they have a lot of economic interest invested into Russia, and they are not interested in following this kind of sanctions. So at the end of the day, there is a lot of noise, and there is a lot of possibilities for Mr. Putin to speculate on this. You may have noticed recently Russian Ministry of Economy published that overall effect of those sanctions, the negative effect on Russian economy, was something like $6.5 billion US. That may sound as a large number, but for Russian economy is nothing. And even if it is not 6 but 12, even if it's not 12 but 20, it's still not that bad, and not the actual toll that we need to impose to make Putin to change what he's doing.
Yes, it's $6.3 billion US, but it influences the population. Real incomes of Russians over the past 5 years have fallen by 11%. The ruble exchange rate for the same period has fallen from 35 to 65 rubles, and the inflation eats up the raise in wages and pensions, and about 20 million Russian citizens live below the poverty line. So what is the Russian government doing? Because this annexation of Crimea is a subsidy territory, so it is expensive to have Crimea. It was expensive to build the bridge that you mentioned. It is expensive to participate in the war in Syria. It is expensive to give a loan to the scandalous Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro. Why does Russia waste all the money and not invest into their own country, into their citizens? I mean, maybe you cannot answer to this question because it's more rhetoric, but why do Russian citizens, why don't they stand up for their life if they do not want to believe what is happening in Ukraine, if they do not want to care what is happening in Ukraine, why wouldn't they stand up for themselves? This is my question.
You know, in politics, when you are standing up, you need to fight not only for yourselves, you need to associate yourself with a certain political force, with certain people, with certain flags, with certain set of ideas. And what was a very important success of Mr. Putin during 20 years of himself being in power is that he said, okay, the choice is between me and going back to 90s. And that's what people don't want to.
They're afraid of going back to 90s.
Absolutely,
obviously.
They would prefer to stay with Putin.
So that was his narrative.
Yes, and unfortunately, again, the West, the way how he plays with the Russian opposition, he helps to sustain this message, because favorite Western people in the ranks of Russian opposition are those who were coming from 90s. And that's why Putin said, okay, so you want Yeltsin time to come back, no problem. Then you vote for them, then you fight for them. Everybody says, no, we don't want this. We may suffer, but in 90s we suffered more than that. Mm-hmm. And when you were speaking about tolls and the actions of Russian government, actually I believe Russian government is enjoying this situation with the sanctions, because everything that they
People
have done wrongly, they diverting this madness and dissatisfaction towards the West.
So they convert this into the aggression against the world and against the European Union, against those countries that are blaming regular Russian people into in this aggression.
You need to play
this is a very
carrot and the stick
scenario. Yeah, this is very interesting.
To be successful. You know, by putting a stick, applying a stick, you need also to show a carrot. And right now there is a carrot which is missing in the equation.
So basically, they're using this vice versa. The very last question, because unfortunately we ran out of time. We ran out of time already. Will the sanctions be able to suppress aggression?
If there would be personal sanctions extended, then yes, it would be effective. So we need more cases like what was done against Mr. Deripaska, against Mr. Vekselberg. There is a long list of people who are way closer to Mr. Putin than Mr. Deripaska and Mr. Vekselberg were. And I think there is much to do.
Well, thank you so much for this interesting conversation, and thank you for this valuable comments.
Thanks for having me.
That was Ilya Ponomarev, former Russian parliamentarian. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Olas Gerjuk. Goodbye.